Yes, hello. It's Jason Louv. Welcome back to the Ultra Culture podcast. My guest today is Steve Bergsman, author of the book I Put a Spell on You, The Bizarre Life of Screamin Jay Hawkins, the legendary rock musician and progenitor of the entire goth genre. As it says on the back of Bergsman's book, Screamin Jay Hawkins was larger than life as he emerged from a coffin with a skull on a stick singing I Put a Spell on You. With one song, Screamin Jay, who studied piano and sang opera, became the embodiment of the voodoo-empowered black man feared by 1950s America, caught between a self-created myth and a nearly unbelievable truth. Which story is better? I Put a Spell on You brings together hundreds of interviews with Screamin Jay, his family, and bandmates to weave a new tale of the life of this seminal rock and roll pioneer. Can the truth of Screamin Jay Hawkins really be known? We're going to find out in this podcast. If you have enjoyed literally any good rock music in the last 50 years, everyone from Bauhaus to Kiss to Alice Cooper to the Cramps to lots more, then you owe Screamin Jay Hawkins a big thank you. So let's dive in and learn more about this figure of rock and roll. But first, super quick, the new tarot course at magick.me is going awesome. We are getting nothing but incredible feedback about it. It's a guided journey through the tarot with none other than legendary, and I do mean legendary, occult author Lon Milo Duquette. But instead of me telling you about it, why don't I let Lon tell you about it? Here's Lon himself with just a few words about the course.
Hello and welcome. I'm Lon Milo Duquette, and I'm delighted to invite you to a transformative journey into the magic of tarot. Whether you're a novice or a seasoned tarot reader, this course promises to enrich your practice and ignite your spiritual aspirations and evolution. But we're not stopping with the tarot. We'll venture further into the beautiful world of the Kabbalah and learn about the spirits within each card and discover how we may interact with them. You can revisit the course whenever you wish, deepening your understanding each time you look at it and take part in it and interact with it. Now, I understand that life can be very busy, and that's why this course is self-paced, and it's designed to fit in even with the busiest schedule. So thank you, and I look forward to guiding you on this incredible magical journey.
All right, you can get that course along with our now almost 30 other courses at magick.me, my online school for magic, meditation, and mysticism. You can find it at www.magick.me, magick.me. All right, I will see you in class, and without any further ado, here is Steve Bergsman. So welcome to the podcast, Steve. I'm excited to talk to you about your book about Screamin Jay Hawkins. Why don't we kick this off? You just want to talk a little bit about your book and what was it that... Well, let's start this off, actually. Why don't you say who Screamin Jay Hawkins was? Because not everyone knows, surprisingly.
Actually, a lot of people don't know Screamin Jay Hawkins, but almost everybody who listens to rock and roll, whether they're 70 years old or they're 25 years old, knows the song, I Put a Spell on You. The song lives on and on and on. I get a reminder from Google, I guess it is, every time that Screamin Jay Hawkins is mentioned in a news story. And it's not so much that Screamin Jay Hawkins is mentioned in a news story once a week. It's that somebody new is recording I Put a Spell on You somewhere in America or around the world.
A lot of people have covered that, right? I mean, I think the Cramps covered it. Marilyn Manson covered it. Anyone else super famous?
The most famous version of I Put a Spell on You, oddly enough, is by Nina Simone, chanteuse sort of the bluesy,
Wonderful,
jazzy.
yeah, wonderful musician.
Right. So she changed the whole nature. That's how versatile that song is. She changed the whole nature of it because it was a wild raucous of a song, just craziness. And she made it into sort of a romantic ballad. So that's how adaptable that song is. And I mean, there are other versions. A number of British bands have recorded it. Punk bands have recorded it.
I think Diamanda Galas did a version. Is that correct?
Who?
Diamanda Galas, the multi-octave goth singer from the 80s.
I think so. So.
Yeah.
But that sounds like something you would know more than I would.
I'm a goth. What can I say?
Yeah. So that's how, if Nina Simone could sing it, the British bands of the 60s can sing it, and a goth band in the 90s, 2000s can sing it.
Yeah.
Then it's a versatile song.
So
everybody knows the song,
yeah.
But people aren't aware of the fellow who sang it, who was equally as bizarre as the song he sung originally, and that's Screamin Jay Hawkins. And you can tell that he was a little off center because he recorded professionally as Screamin Jay. So this was a time everybody in the 50s. So this song came out in 56. So you were Chuck Berry, or you were Elvis Presley, or if you were really out there, you were a Little Richard or somebody. But Screamin Jay, that was somebody.
He was definitely more out there than Little Richard, and at least in my opinion. But what was it about him? Well, let's stay on this. I mean, like, who was he? Maybe talk a little bit about his biography, where he came from, some of the challenges that he faced, and what his, who he was, if you can give kind of the audience a sense of that.
So Screamin Jay came out of Cleveland, and he was raised by a foster parent. And this is where it gets weird, because I have to remember my own book. I think he was one of 4 children. He always claimed he was one of 7, but I think in actuality he was one of 4. And the mother kept the other 3, but she had they didn't have a lot of money. I don't want to say they were impoverished, but they were close to the edge. And the mother felt that economically she couldn't raise 4 children. So Screamin Jay was raised by a foster parent, but that was down the street. So the mother would still visit Screamin Jay as he was raised by another woman. However, Screamin Jay never got over the fact that his mother didn't raise him. And he harbored that grudge all his life. And so he was an angry guy for almost all his life. He had many, many weird quirks. First of all, he was a very good musician, and he could play almost any instrument. And so he was versatile. He could play a horn or piano or the electric guitar. So he was very good. But he had these very bizarre quirks. And I don't want to get political here, but he was like a very well-known politician who had trouble with the truth. Screamin Jay could barely utter 3 sentences without one of them being a falsehood. And he was always telling stories about his life to reporters, and the stories sort of never jived with a story he told somebody else. Most famously, he enlisted, if I remember correctly, around 46. He was born in 29, so it was around 45 or 46, but he missed World War II. And according to everything that I found, he served for 6 years. And I think he missed the Korean War as well. However, if you interviewed him, he was a hero of either World War II or the Korean War, and he often got confused which war he was the hero of.
Okay.
But I think an earlier interviewer got him to say he was in like the band of the armed services. So he wasn't actually on the front lines at any point. Missed World War II, probably missed Korean War, but it didn't stop him from telling the most fanciful stories ever of his heroism in either war. So he had trouble with the truth. That was a problem with Screamin Jay.
So that's interesting to me because, you know, he kind of comes out of nowhere and does this song, I Put a Spell on You, and many, many others. He had a long career, but there's always been this, you know, there was always this element of the occult to Screamin Jay Hawkins, and this element of, you know, maybe voodoo or some type of, you know, mysterious thing going on. Although I'm sure, well, please, I mean, definitely correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like it was pretty much show business. But he's definitely this trickster character that kind of doesn't fit in with his time, doesn't fit in with anyone around him, and just kind of comes out of nowhere to change rock and roll forever. And in many ways, and I'm not the only person to have said this. I mean, I was doing a bit of reading before this interview. You know, a lot of people say that he invented goth rock almost ahead of time. You know, maybe there wouldn't be an Alice Cooper without Screamin Jay Hawkins. There wouldn't be a Bauhaus or a Marilyn Manson or any of these things.
That's very accurate. I would say, you know, the whole performance art. I'll address your occult statement as well. But let me just go back to performance art, where you know, starting in the 50s, if you went to a rock and roll concert, and all the rock and roll concerts were the same, the impresario would assemble about a dozen famous names, and they would all tour together. And you know, the first guy would get up, sing 2 songs, sit down. The next group would get up, sing 2 songs, sit down, and it'd be like that for all the stars, the 12 stars on the show. And they would tour by bus, and they go around the country. And sometimes they'd have to do 2 or 3 shows a day like this. So it wasn't as it is now, where you go to a concert, it's some major band or a major singer, just one person. Maybe they have an opening act, maybe not. You know, you go see Taylor Swift, you're going to see Taylor Swift, and she may or may not have an opening act. But in the 50s, the first ever rock and roll concerts were aggregations of all these bands, and that was the format. And it wasn't even Screamin Jay's idea. It was Alan Freed. Alan Freed was the most famous disc jockey in the country in the mid 1950s, and that's because when he was in Cleveland, the home of Screamin Jay Hawkins, he first had one of the earliest, as a white DJ, late night shows that played just rhythm and blues music. And this rhythm and blues music would eventually turn to rock and roll. And people say, oh, Alan Freed invented rock and roll, but he didn't. He just invented the name rock and roll. He just borrowed it from what was going on out there. Anyway, Alan Freed goes to Screamin Jay one night at one of these shows before the show begins, and he says, I have an idea for you. So he has this crazy, crazy song out, I Put a Spell on You. And Alan Freed says to him, why don't you emerge from a coffin to sing it? And Screamin Jay goes, oh, you know, black guys, we don't go to coffins. We don't do that. And then Alan Freed, you know, puts his hand in his pocket, pulls out a wad of bills, and says, you know, here's a couple of $100. You want a big show? Why don't you do this? And Screamin Jay, when the wad of bills in his hand gets big enough, he says, sure, I'll do this. And so he does you might say, the first performance art in rock and roll, where to sing I Put a Spell on You, he emerges from a coffin. So you know, other bands that sort of do that kind of performance art it all stems from that. But I got to take you back even further.
Can I jump in? Can I jump in real quick? Because
Sure.
I don't want to lose your point, but it strikes me, was this before or after Screamin' Lord Such in England? Because it sounds like Screamin' Lord Such's act, and obviously the word screamin' is in there.
Screamin Jay, I think it was the late 50s or early 60s, toured England. So his song, I Put a Spell on You, came out in 56. Next year, there was a Screamin Jay album, and he appeared in one. No, he didn't. He was going to appear in one of the Alan Freed movies, and he didn't. Anyway, he tours England for the first time, and he meets Lord Such. And Lord Such borrowed, you might say, the whole act.
Oh, so it was the other way around.
Yeah. Lord Such
interesting. Okay. Cool. That makes, I guess, unfortunately, makes a lot of sense. Yeah. For those who don't know, Screamin' Lord Such was an act in at that time in England, and he was a guy who kind of dressed like Jack the Ripper and did the whole, Cramps before the Cramps or the Damned before the Damned act, and kind of came out and did the Ghouls and Goblins rock show.
Yeah, there was another British performer at the same time who also stole Screamin' Jay's act. I'm trying to think of his name, but his song was Fire. And it was actually number one song.
The one where it's like, I bring you fire.
Yeah.
Who is it? Yeah. I know which one you're talking about. Arthur Brown, Crazy World of Arthur Brown.
Yeah, The Crazy World of Arthur Brown. That was it. Yeah.
So unfortunate that song was later played, unfortunately, during the Christchurch shootings in New Zealand, and so it's got a bit of a bad vibe now. But yeah, I know the song.
Yeah. So, but even I just told you a story about the coffin, but Screamin' Jay was a very, I don't want to say crazy, over dapper, wild dresser even then. So, but the question is, where did he get that from? So now I'm going to tell you the story and of how Screamin' Jay began to look like Screamin' Jay, because he always had a wild looking act. And as you probably know, he always came on stage with a cane that had a skull on top of the cane, and he would talk to that skull, and the skull had a name. Sometimes the skull would be smoking a cigarette when he came out. So that was all part of his act. So he's in Cleveland, and remember, I'm talking about Alan Freed. So Alan Freed has this first show that was dedicated to R&B, and it was really targeted to white teenagers, not necessarily black teenagers. It's around 1952. It's Cleveland. He has this ridiculous radio DJ patter. He calls his show like the Moondog Show, and he's playing all this great R&B. And he decides to have a concert in Cleveland. And if he didn't invent the word rock and roll, Alan Freed definitely invented the first rock and roll show. So he sets the format. So there's going to be about 8 acts, and it's going to be at the Veterans or Coliseum or something in Cleveland, a venue that was big enough to sit 10,000 people. And he calls his show the Moondog Coronation. It's 1952. One of the headliners of that show was a guy called Tiny Grimes. And the show, as the show's getting ready to unveil that night in Cleveland, 20,000 Cleveland area teenagers show up, scaring the daylights out of the local police who fear there's going to be a mob scene. The first act barely gets through one song where the police close the whole thing down. So Alan Freed not only invents the first rock and roll show, but he has the first rock and roll riot which wasn't actually a riot, but the police thought it was.
That's that's good credentials right there.
Yeah, so when Tiny Grimes leaves town, Screamin Jay Hawkins goes with him. Now, Screamin Jay Hawkins was married and had children, but he just gets in the car and leaves with Tiny Grimes, heading back to New York. Now, Tiny Grimes had been around a while and was a very esteemed musician. He played with a lot of the beat jazz musicians. He had some moderate hits in the 40s, but he tries to stay up with the times, and he creates a band called the Rockin' Highlanders. So it's 4 or 5 black guys, all dressed in tartans with tams and the Scottish skirts, whatever. They even do a rockin' version of the traditional Scottish song, Loch Lomond, you take the high road, I'll take the low road song. And it was a funny bit. And they were crazy. They were wild and they were ribald. And Screamin Jay Hawkins joined the group, and he learned how to put on, not only sing, but learn how to put on a crazy show and dress weirdly, playing with Tiny Grimes. And then he sort of took that with him when he went out on his own and played with other bands. He played with a lot of esteemed people like Fats Domino for a while. But when he started to record, and this goes back to your question about the cult, he had 2 themes basically in many of his early songs, and he wrote most of his own songs. One was wine, and that was a popular motif in R&B in the early 1950s. Everybody had to have a booze song, mostly a wine song, and so early Screamin Jay Hawkins songs, Before I Put a Spell on You, had wine in it.
Was this still the 50s, or was this in the 60s now?
No, we're still in the 50s. We're in the very
50s.
early 50s. We're before the advent of rock and roll. We're in
oh wow,
50,
okay,
53.
Okay.
So, and his other theme was sort of I wouldn't call it a cult, but it was more voodoo-ish. So it would be songs like, I'm trying to think of his early songs, but he did have one. So one of his early songs was Baptize Me in Wine. But another early song was I Put the Whammy on You.
Mm.
So he had a tendency to write these sort of, it was called She Put the Whammy on Me. So he had a tendency to go off in this direction as well. Again, it was more voodoo-ish than the occult. That's probably you're thinking of it.
Well, let's talk about that then. I want to focus in on that. So let's talk about Udon. And that is very interesting to me because there's obviously such a through line of African traditional music to, unfortunately, slave music to Udon music in the New World and also back in Africa, and then into rock and roll. And you have things like, for instance, Robert Johnson allegedly selling his soul at the Crossroads, which is a very, very Udon thing. Not with the devil, but with the Loa. And then you have Screamin Jay Hawkins, who is clearly adopting elements of Udon for his stage act. But my question, I guess I have a twofold question there. One is, what are your thoughts on that in general? And then my second is, I get the sense with Screamin Jay Hawkins that it's probably pretty much all showbiz, but maybe there's another element to it as well. And I'm just curious about all of that.
Well, it really is all showbiz, but nobody else was going in the same direction as Screamin Jay Hawkins. So he was so idiosyncratic. And again, he wrote a lot of his own tunes that his songs were so different from anybody else who was recording at the time. Remember, the R&B had in the early 50s had sort of smoothed out to doo-wop. Doo-wop was a group sound, and there was a lot of old chestnuts that got redone as doo-wop format, and they were all, otherwise they were novelty songs or love songs. But nobody was doing whatever was in Screamin Jay Hawkins' head at the time, that he would, write these songs. So he had his, whatever channel he was tapped into, it was his own and not anybody else's. So we can say it's, it was for showbiz, but at the same time, it wasn't, because some of these songs were clearly, they're bizarre today, but they were really out there.
So when you say they weren't showbiz, what do you mean by that? What is it that you think that he was tapped into that transcended that?
Well, because he was such an angry guy throughout his life. If he had to go to a show, to do a show, and they would say, okay, we got to do this, and we got to do this, then he wouldn't do it. He would just do his own thing. He had a song, probably his second most famous song. It's called Constipation Blues.
Yeah, I love that song. It's about real pain. Real pain.
Yes. Let it go. Whatever he's singing at the time. So sometimes he'd be booked into sort of a middle of the road venue. One time he was booked into a supper club, and a lot of people were older than his normal crowd, and his band would say, "Let's not do Constipation Blues," but Screamin Jay would start off with Constipation Blues.
How did that play with the audience? Do you have any records of that?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
I guess that for those who don't know that song, you should definitely look it up on YouTube. But it's a blues song about being constipated, because he said no one's ever written a blues song about real pain. But my question was, how did that song play with the audience? Is there any record of that?
Well, I know that story because one of the person who actually told me that I should write a book about Screamin Jay Hawkins was a guy named Mike Armando, and he played in the backup band to Screamin Jay through the 70s. And he would tell me these odd stories about Screamin Jay. And he told me that story about Screamin Jay, the band saying, let's calm down here. Let's not do anything crazy. And Screamin Jay says, we're going to start off with Constipation Blues. And by the time they were done, half the people in the audience had left.
Okay.
But he didn't mind doing that. He didn't mind insulting people. So he was always contrary. I'll just give you another story. So after I Put a Spell on You, he couldn't find another hit. It just, even when he went outside his own songs, and the most famous songwriting team in the early 50s for rock and roll, they wrote Jailhouse Rock and songs like that, was Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller.
Mm-hmm.
And they wrote a song just for Screamin Jay called Alligator Wine. And couldn't even sell that. So he's gigging with different people. He's still has a name. He's still getting on rock and roll shows, and Red Top Records, which was really a middle of the road teen idol kind of label, says, "Okay, we'll sign you. We'll record a couple of songs and see what happens." So it's a vanilla type label. And so what does he record for them? Probably his second most infamous song, not as famous, but second most infamous song after Constipation Blues, and that's Armpit Number 6.
Okay. What's the story behind that?
So at the time, and I think there's still a perfume called Chanel Number 5. And
yes.
So instead of Chanel Number 5, this was Armpit Number 6.
Okay.
And that's what he recorded for Red Top. This song, nobody was ever going to release this song. Certainly not Red Top Records. So he was always doing something contrary.
Well, this is interesting because I feel like this is very endemic with geniuses. They are constantly contrary to the point of their own detriment, and then tend to blame fate or society for not giving them a hand up. But they're kind of sabotaging their own success at every turn. And it sounds like that might be something that he was suffering from. Although, you know, all of the songs you've mentioned are infinitely more interesting than anything else that, you know, that I can think of being recorded at that time. So,
yeah. So, and I would agree with you. He continually sabotaged his career, and remember I told you the story about him not telling the truth. It was always difficult.
Yeah.
So, no matter how good you were to Screamin' Jay, if you did a favor for him, if you married him, if you put him in a movie, anything kind, if you lent him money, he would still lie to you.
Hmm.
Matter of fact, sometimes you got the bigger lie. If you were nice to him, you got the bigger lie. And I'll just give you another example. So he had been down and out for a while, but in the 80s, the punk band sort of discovered him, and he had a career resurgence. And independent movie maker Jim Jarmusch put him in. First, he did a whole movie with the theme "I Put a Spell on You." So it was an independent movie. It was called, I got to find it. Stranger Than Paradise.
Yeah. Yeah. Very famous. And
then he actually put Screamin' Jay in a movie, and Screamin' Jay was very good in it. And it was called Mystery Train. It was about a sort of a Fleabag hotel in Memphis.
Yeah, named after the Grail Marcus book, I think, right?
I think so,
yeah.
Yes. And so Screamin' Jay plays somebody at the welcoming desk, who, takes the name, greets them, gives them a key, etc. And two of the people who come in are Japanese. And Screamin' Jay goes to Jim Jarmusch and he says, "Oh, I don't know how I can work with these Japanese, considering my war record with and then he's confused because it's either the Japanese or Koreans, because whichever story he's telling. And I have trouble with Asians. I don't know if I can work with these two Japanese actors." Also negating the fact that he was married for 20 years to a woman of Philippine descent. So Here's Jim Jarmusch giving him the break of a lifetime. He's putting him in a movie, and he's giving Jim Jarmusch the usual Screamin' Jay bullshit. And then he says, okay, I'll work with him. But he has to go through all the nonsense first.
Yeah. So what do you think that was? I mean, you've mentioned that he was a really angry person, and clearly he was self-sabotaging, and it sounds perhaps to a pathological degree. And he was constantly lying to everyone. I mean, that's more, this sounds to me like actually a lot more than the run of the mill kind of rock star bullshit. This sounds like something serious was going on.
Yes. And somehow he made it all work for a lifetime. It didn't work for a lot of times. A lot of times he was quite impoverished. Again, sabotaging. If he had to appear on a bill with another group, he'd fight the people to be the closer or the premier act of the bill. So he was always in squabble with other people. And this was sort of a lifetime of fighting with others. He never really calmed down. And I'll get to the ultimate Screamin' Jay ploy. So he's on tour in Australia, and it's a long tour. And he'd show up at a club, and he'd find out ahead of time if the club was sold out. Now he's already gotten paid. So, but he'd show up at the club and say, I never got paid. Now, the poor fellow who owns this club in Wobegon, Australia, wherever, what's he going to do? He has a club full of people. Screamin Jay is there, but Screamin Jay saying he never got paid. So the poor club owner has to fork over the money again. So, in fact, Screamin Jay was double dipping. He'd get paid, say he didn't, but poor club owner said, Screamin Jay wouldn't. I goes, I'm not getting on unless I get my money first. So that's the way. So, but then he got caught out on that by the tour operator, and he left Australia. But this was something common that Screamin Jay would do. Mm. And you might say, okay, so he's pulling this stunt to get more money. But the promoters back then, they were a sleazy bunch. Rock and roll was
I don't think that's changed much.
Yeah, it was a very sleazy game, and promoters would steal money. The record companies would put their names on the record so they can get royalties. Even Alan Freed forced his name on some records so he can get royalties. It was a very sleazy business.
So we're still talking about the 50s here, right?
Yeah.
So I want to pause for a second.
What was that?
I want to pause on that for a second.
Sure.
I want to. So many details of this time period are emerging from everything that you're saying, and I really wanted to pause for a second and really focus on what that world was like, because it's so different from the world now, particularly all these details of the music industry that you're sharing, but there's all these other dynamics at play. So even when you're talking about riots, things like this, I want to get a sense of, because this is something that we just take for granted that we understand, but that moment when rock and roll came into the mainstream, and what that was like. And, clearly there, it's also a story about race relations in America and England. There were, and I was reading about Screamin Jay Hawkins that actually he caught a lot of flack from the NAACP about his act, that they thought it would set black people back. But this is just this moment of collision of cultures. And, even when you were talking about like the riots and the cops, and then things like with Lord Sutch stealing his act, the Rolling Stones stealing black music. There's so many kind of sociological undercurrents to the stuff that you're talking about, and racial undercurrents. And I wanted to maybe just take a moment to talk about kind of like what those dynamics were like, what that time was like, and how that played out in the music industry, which sounds very different from what we understand now, and also not different. But
so there were two things going on in America in the 50s. And why am I focusing on the 50s? Because in 1955, there was a movie called The Blackboard Jungle. It was a violent teen movie. And that movie opened up with a song called Rock Around the Clock. And this was kind of the purest form of rock and roll that nobody had ever heard before. Mm. And it was such a popular movie that song not only sort of crossed over to white America, because it was a very segregated world. So that was white America's first big blush with what would become rock and roll. Elvis Presley would hit in 1956. That's when he would have his first biggest hit. That was 1956. So rock and roll really hit America in 55 and 56. But what was happening before that on the pop stations were still really playing mediocre music. It was all in the 40s, it was the big bands, and then the big bands would have a singer and And this singer was more or less what we call crooning. They would sing these lush ballads, and the biggest name in crooning was Frank Sinatra.
Mm-hmm.
So Frank Sinatra was the gold standard of crooners. So that all began in the World War II years, in the 40s. But in the 1950s, that was still the main stream of what was played on the mainstream radio stations in the 50s. And it was void of any creativity, and it was frankly boring. So the teenagers, and we're talking mostly the white teenagers now, were seeking different music, and they would find these rhythm and blues stations. Many of them were at night, and they'd listen to the R&B music. What was happening in the music world was there was such a dearth of creativity for these songs, these crooning songs that dominated the radio, that the white singers would hear these R&B songs and copy them. So there was which was called covering. So they covered the R&B song as a white song. So that was what was going on in the 1950s. There was such a lack of creativity in the white world of music that they would look to other sources.
So basically, they were just ripping off black music and stealing from black people.
They were, but they started by ripping off the country music. That's where in the late 40s.
That's interesting.
They started ripping off the country music because that was the easiest place to go. And then by the 50s, they started ripping off the black music, just what you were saying. So that became an issue in the 1950s. So when I got there were two things going on in the 50s. First of all, it was really an intense era of Jim Crow. It was a segregated world. There was the world of black people and the world of white people. And really the two rarely crossed over. And then rhythm and blues to rock and roll happened. And at least in the entertainment industry, things started to merge.
I want to talk about that real quick. I mean,
Sure.
I don't want to derail you. I want to keep going with what you were saying. But when we talk about segregation, this is another thing that I want to dig into, because this is another thing that people kind of like pay lip service to and perhaps pass over. And obviously, in America and the world, because of the politician you mentioned, we have undergone, unfortunately, a very racist time. But I wonder if we really have a sense of what segregation was like for people who didn't live through that. I think, and anything you want to say about that, about what that was like on a day-to-day lived basis, that would be great. And I mean, even to the point where, I don't want to underestimate how big of a moment it was that I would say black music came into white people's consciousness at that time. But that dovetailed in a way with segregation, but there were all these undercurrents of co-option, and you have, and using it, and, people like Elvis or the Beatles or the Rolling Stones, perhaps sanitizing it, in their mind or in the radio DJ's minds for white kids. And that, and then they went off to make all the money, and the people that they stole from got nothing, which is a very old story.
Right. So now I'm a white guy. I'm an old white guy. So, but I grew up in the 50s. And in the 50s, especially throughout the South, the world was entirely segregated. And there were many things black people could not do. Could not walk the street at night. That was outlawed in some towns. They could not go to a park if white people were at a park. This is in the South. They could not go there because white people there. By regulation, they could not be in the same club, entertainment venue if black people were there, or white people couldn't be there. Black people were there. Black people couldn't be there. if white people. You couldn't use the same bathrooms. You couldn't. Black people often couldn't stay in hotels across America. They had to stay in their own hotels. In the South, the South repressed the blacks, so many of them lost voting rights. And that was just the South. But in the North, things weren't much better. If you were in a big city, there were black neighborhoods and there were white neighborhoods. And, rarely the twain met. And there were always violence against black people. So it was a very tough time. This was the Jim Crow era of America. And blacks just didn't have the same rights as white people throughout the country. And you were kind of technically allowed to discriminate across America. So when white teenagers started to listen to black music, that was a big deal because but they did so because the white music was so terrible. You had to find really where the cutting edge was, and the cutting edge was R&B. But I want to just go back one other thing about the 50s.
Mm-hmm.
So teenagers in the 30s, that was the Depression. Teenagers in the 30s had to go to work because everybody needed to work in the Depression. There was no money. So teenagers worked. Comes the 40s, it's World War II. Teenagers now had to enlist or be drafted, and they went off to war. War's over in 45. The new teenagers coming up, let's say you were 13 in 1950 or 14 in 1950, a young teenager in the 50s. What was happening, the teenagers, that segment of the population had swelled, even though, we were in war and we were in depression, people still had babies. But those new teenagers didn't have to go to war. They could stay in school. They didn't have to, find a job or support the family farm or whatever. And America discovered teenagers like they never existed before. So,
well, from my understanding, even the phrase teenagers was created by ad agencies during that time because it was a new market with disposable income for the first time.
Or another since like the 20s or 30s. And but it became a thing in the 50s. And with teenagers came, rock and roll music and all these things that scared their parents. But there was the entertainment industry discovered teenagers, and they would pump out a steady stream of horror movies, for example, and monster movies. But then there were the more violent teenage gang movies.
Yeah.
And that was also
it's so funny that all that stuff is so funny in retrospect, but yeah, I guess it was frightening at the time.
So, and parents were, there was this new thing, teenagers, and parents didn't know how, what's my teenage, everybody was worried about teenagers. They're, gang behavior, or they're listening to black music. So everybody was fearful of teenagers in the 1950s because it was like the world just discovered there was such a thing as teenagers. So the first, before the Blackboard, we talked about Blackboard Jungle, but before that there was Wild One with Marlon Brando as a head of a bike gang that invades the small town. So that was an extremely popular movie with teenagers. So there was that, and
was
then
that the Wild Ones?
Yeah, the Wild Ones, right? And then there was Blackboard Jungle, and then there was the James Dean movie with Natalie Wood. Oh, it escapes me now, which was also
Rebel Without a Cause.
That's it, Rebel Without a Cause. Also immensely popular with teenagers. They were so popular that these movie studios would would start pumping out, like teenage movies made for about $100,000, which was, even then it was nothing. And then they would play on the drive-in theaters. So, and drive-in theaters were a big deal because teenagers were driving now. They didn't have their own cars in the 30s and the 40s, but in the 50s, they wanted cars. But there was no place to take your girlfriend if you wanted to make out or more. So they all went to drive-ins. And you see these B and C movies on the screen, but nobody cared because they're all
right,
huddled up in the back seat or something. So that was teenage life in the 50s.
Got it. Okay, so yeah, it's just such a different time, and I feel like the 50s are a time that are just brushed over and glossed over so much, and kind of even more than I don't know, some caricature of the 60s or something like that. It's just there's not a whole lot of attention paid to them, although it's clearly like the critical moment of the 20th century certainly in American pop culture, and this moment where everything changes. And I suspect that the 50s were a lot darker, and there was a whole lot, much darker undercurrents going on of, like you say, segregation, of racism, of the fears of, white people being afraid of black people and teenagers, and also just, alcoholism, trauma from the war, all of this stuff that, it's always portrayed as this Ozzie and Harriet kind of world. But it seems to me that the 50s were kind of phenomenally dark and sinister in some ways.
So it was. But if people think of everything really big bursting out in the 60s, the music, the protests, Martin Luther King, hippies, all that, Summer of Love in 1967. But everything had precedent, and that was all this began in the 50s. So if you think of the 60s, the hippies, well, there were the Beats in the 50s. They were, quote unquote, the nonconformists. Mm-hmm. And that was a big issue. Do you conform? That was a big issue in the 50s. Are you conforming to the Eisenhower type middle America of the world? And the Beats, who preceded the hippies, said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to, hang out in places like the East Village or San Francisco and smoke weed. Nobody smoked weed in the 50s, but, and, go to play our bongos or whatever they did in the 50s. So there was an element of people who were different, who were trying to take the world in a different way. And that includes the Black movement to integrate America. That all began in the 50s as well. And a lot of the key, Brown versus education, that all happened in the 1950s. So 60s get all the credit, but it just didn't go from egg to adult in the 60s. It all really started in the 1950s. And I'd just like to bring that up.
So,
go on.
Oh, I was just going to say, why don't we bring it back to Screamin Jay Hawkins, and that's some good context, and just how he moved through this time.
So I should tell you the story then of how I Put a Spell on You got recorded, and why it's such a monumental record, which of course it is all by accident. So Screamin Jay had come east with Tiny Grimes, and then left Tiny Grimes, and he played with a number of fairly well-known bands at the time, including Fats Domino and his band. And he got to know a lot of people in the recording industry back east, in the sort of the New York, Philadelphia area, and a lot of sort of great musicians. And he was able to scare up some recording contracts. So he did his first recordings around, I'm guessing around 53, 54. I think Baptize Me in Wine was 1954. So these were small labels, but it was his first time in a recording studio, recording under his real name was Jalacy, Jalacy, and then he became Jay Hawkins and finally Screamin Jay Hawkins. And so he knew a lot of good musicians. And I think it was OK, or OKEH, that was the label. And he was brought in to do some recording. And one of the songs the producer wanted to record was I Put a Spell on You. But at that time, I Put a Spell on You was a ballad. So when the song was first conceived by Screamin Jay Hawkins, it was a ballad where it ended up with Nina Simone. But at the time, the producer thought there was more to I Put a Spell on You than just being a ballad. He wanted something new out of that song. And he wasn't getting it in the recording session. Now, it wasn't that Screamin Jay had just found some musicians. The musicians that went in there, and he was going to record 4 songs, basically 2 what were called 45s at the time. 45 was how a teenager heard music. They either heard it on the radio or they bought this small platter. It went at 45 RPMs. It was called.
So that was a single. It was a single record.
Yeah. So it was the A side was whatever the A song was, and on the back was the B. So they were going to record 4 songs for what could be 2 singles, you might say. But there was always an A and B side, so it was actually 4 songs. So they're doing I Put a Spell on You, and the producer's not happy. It was all flat. And he says, let's take a break. And he comes back with like a bucket of chicken and plenty of booze. So the musicians, and these, again, I want to make, these weren't just pickup musicians. In this recording session, he had some of the best studio musicians in New York with him.
Oh, really?
I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just surprised by that. But yeah, he was like blackout drunk when he recorded that, right?
Right. Yeah. So this is what happened. So one of the musicians was Mickey Baker, and he was the Eric Clapton of his time. I mean, if you wanted the best electric guitar musician at your recording, you got Mickey Baker. Now, Mickey Baker had a moment of fame. He teamed up with a female singer. They became Mickey and Sylvia, and they had this big song called Love is Strange. Major hit in the mid-50s. And it was featured in the movie Dirty Dancing, if you remember that one. But anyway, Mickey Baker's there, and Big Al Sears. I mean, he had major musicians. They take a break. All of them. They take a break. They're having their lunch, but they're drinking a lot. They're drinking gallons of, as Screamin Jay would say, it was like Muscatel or some cheap wine. And by the time they're getting ready to sing again, they're drunk. They're flat out drunk. They could barely stand. But you pay for studio time. You got to record the song.
Yep.
So they record "I Put a Spell on You," and remember, it was originally a ballad, but in this version, Screamin Jay is grunting and growling and snarling and making all these bizarre noises as he's singing I Put a Spell on You. And it was really a I don't want to overuse the word, but it was a very bizarre cut.
Well, it's got to be one of the all-time great rock and roll performances ever, right?
Yes,
I mean, it's so iconic. And I didn't know until I did the little bit of reading for this podcast that he was drunk. I mean, it's like, it just sounds like he's channeling something from, he's channeling something completely at odds with everything else that was out in the culture at that time.
Yeah, and it was. I'd wager to say it's still a crazy record, or song, even if you played it today.
Yeah, it is, absolutely. I think that's why it gets covered so much. It's out of time in a way. It stands outside of the flows of pop culture in a way. And I think it's like you mentioned, Rock Around the Clock being kind of the platonic essence of the rock and roll song. Well, I think that one maybe even more so. And I think that's why it has been so influential on just generation after generation of musicians. I mean, I think that one truly is a timeless record.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, almost every week I get a notification of somebody, many recording us. I don't even know. I've never heard of them. They're so new, and they're all singing "I Put a Spell on You." Yeah,
I mean, it's a perfect song, I think.
So what happened then? So the producer loved the song, and they create, as you said, a single. But it scared. Remember, the parents were scared about their teenagers.
What was the fear? What was the fear there? Really, do you think?
Well, two things. First of all, teenagers were out of their control. So that was a new phenomenon. Teenagers were not in their control. Teenagers were listening to music that they didn't understand because they grew up on big band music in the 40s.
Would you say that teenagers were out of control because of cars?
They weren't so much out of control, but parents thought their teenagers were out of control.
Okay.
They were hanging out.
Well, they had freedom of movement, like in a way that nobody had before. And then you mentioned drive-throughs and, people having sex in the back of these large cars that they later purposefully made much smaller so people couldn't do that anymore. Anyways, just a bit of a tangent.
Yeah. So anyway, there was pressure on some of the radio stations not to play the song. So a lot of radio stations did not play "I Put a Spell on You," but it had a sort of a reputation by that time, and it still sold. People say it sold 1 million copies, which I had no way of verifying that. But it was an extremely popular record, even though most radio stations would not play it because it was too extreme. And if they did play it, parents would call in and complain, and advertisers said, "Oh, well, we're not going to advertise if you play that crazy song." So it didn't get it missed a lot of radio stations, but by reputation, it sold a lot.
Yeah, I mean, even to mention that song, I mean, it carries this totemic power with it. I mean, it's like one of the things the many things I love about that song. It's just got this element of menace to it, this undercurrent of menace that I don't know what you could relate that to. I mean, maybe the Peggy Lee song "Fever" from 1958, but certainly more this song. It's got this menace, this sexual menace, this element of the occult, of mind control, of voodoo. It's like all these things are perfectly wrapped up, of possessiveness, and you can just hear the entirety of like the goth genre in that song. And maybe I'm wrong, but I can't think of any songs from that time or earlier, unless you maybe want to talk about kind of like Frank Sinatra implying mob connections or something like that, but they just have that element of menace to them.
It would be hard to find a song, even today, that has that sort of atmospheric sense of menace that you talk about.
Certainly today. I mean, everything is so everything is so sensitive and sensitized now. And that song, you mentioned teenagers being out of control. It's like that song, it rarely, I think, despite rock's pretensions, truly feels like it's out of control. Like it's like it cannot be controlled, and something like very wrong is happening. But it's not just wrong; it's fascinating and enticing.
Yeah, it's one of those songs. I mean, sometimes you can get tired of a song, but I don't know if you can get tired of "I Put a Spell on You," because it sort of comes at you in a unexpected way. And then it's like nothing else you have ever heard.
Mm-hmm.
So the evolution of "I Put a Spell on You," so it's sold because of this reputation, even though it didn't get played on the radio. And so that put the record company in a bind. How do we get Screamin Jay Hawkins across to the mainstream audience? How do we make people aware of Screamin Jay Hawkins? They didn't know what to do. And by the time they got to putting an album out, they sort of sanitized them, and they tried to sort of normalize them, for the big cover art of the album. And the album itself was a mixed bag of Screamin Jay Hawkins tune and old chestnuts that actually he liked to sing, old songs from the 40s, but it really wasn't a cohesive album. And then nothing he ever did again sort of worked for America, for the American radio audience.
Interesting. Yet he channeled, it's like, it's funny how it's so often like that for artists. It's like, they struggle their whole life and hone their craft. And it's like, but they really just get that, like lightning hits them like once or maybe twice. But that one time it hits for a great artist could change history, which, or certainly change the course of art or pop culture or how people are seeing themselves. And I think that's definitely the case with this song. So much comes out of it. But I just have always found that just so interesting, where it's like, sometimes lightning just hits once and that's all you get. But when it hits, it hits.
Yeah. And that's pretty much what it was like for Screamin Jay. And it's not healthy or mentally healthy for the artist who is going to struggle to find that next song, but can't. So you always wonder, sort of like, oh, the one hit wonder. Well, he did this great one hit, but that poor artist, had a lifetime to live, and he's trying to find the next song and can never do it. So it must be. So it was discouraging to Screamin Jay, and it didn't help his anger issues. So and no matter what they did, but again, he would sabotage. For example, so teen movies. So we talked about the world of teens, and other than the gang movies, I'll bring back Alan Freed again. So Alan Freed said, okay, I'm going to make some movies for teenagers, and just like my shows, I'll spotlight, 3 or 4 singers. And to Alan Freed's credit, he would put black performers in his movies. It wasn't just, Bill Haley. He'd have Chuck Berry in his movies. And one of his earliest movies, and these were very popular movies in the mid-50s. These were just for teenagers. And he was going to put, Alan Freed liked Screamin Jay Hawkins. And we mentioned that it was Alan Freed's idea to have him come out of the coffin. And that was pretty much one of the earliest big Alan Freed extravaganza shows. Alan Freed was a rock and roll impresario besides being a DJ, and he'd have these great big shows. It would run the biggest theater in Brooklyn, and he'd have 3 of these shows a day, and he'd have like 15 performers, and the audience would be packed. They'd get them all out. The next audience would come in. They'd do the show all over again 3 times a day. It was the same at the Apollo in Harlem. Anyway, so Screamin' Jay was going to be in one of these early Alan Freed movies. And Alan Freed always showed the best of these rock and roll performers, that they were polite, they were dangerous, they just were there to put out good music, and the teens were lovely. So he was going to put Screamin' Jay in one of his early movies. And I couldn't figure out whether it was Alan Freed or the directors or Screamin' Jay's idea to come out dressed as some version of bizarre African warrior of his own dreamlike making, in a loincloth and a bone in his nose and rattles and things like that. And that session was recorded, but it was so bizarre that they cut it out. So, why would you do that to Screamin' Jay Hawkins unless because it just didn't fit the movie, and nobody was going to put that into a movie. It was kind of self-righteous, you might say.
Yeah. Well, there's so obviously an element of racism to that. But then the flip side that I wanted to ask you about is he was also disliked by the NAACP at the time, if I remember, and there was kind of maybe some criticisms of minstrelsy, maybe.
Well, he wasn't so minstrel, but he put a bone in his nose.
I mean, that's pretty charged.
Yeah, and that was the key thing. I mean, it wasn't that he just dressed bizarrely and he had a smoking skull on his cane, but I mean, the last offensive thing that he can do was have that bone in his nose, which he didn't care what the NAACP said. He kept it. He kept it just in spite, as part of his act. There's I mentioned Mike Armando, who played with Screamin' Jay in the 70s. And it was his idea for me to look into Screamin' Jay's life and write the book. And after I came out with the book, he formed a band. You might call it a tribute band. And and they still play, and they're really very good, The Resurrection of Screamin' Jay Hawkins Band. That's the name of it. And they play a lot in the Northeast. And they have a guy, a really good singer, who does all the Screamin' Jay shtick. He comes out of a coffin. When they do Constipation Blues, he sings it from the toilet. But he also puts the bone in his nose, has that, it's a clip-on, it doesn't go through his nose. But he does all the Screamin' Jay Hawkins shtick. And it's a very good show. But there's the bone. Because people remembered that from the original Screamin' Jay shows. And that was, the really offensive thing that the NAACP, whose whole objective was to improve the image of the black man in America.
So what was that? What was that conflict? I mean, how did that go down? Were they talking directly, or? They would editorial pieces, opinion pieces. Okay.
If they were interviewed for a newscast, they would talk about it. So there was, I guess they tried to do public pressure.
And what was his opinion of that? I mean, did he see that in racial terms, or did he just see it as somebody trying to tell him how to do his act? I mean, I don't know.
It was all part of his contrary nature. Somebody's telling me what to do, I'm going to do the opposite.
Okay. Interesting. So why don't we talk about his influence? I mean, obviously that song is immortal, but talk a little bit about the influence of Screamin Jay Hawkins on bands since, bands now, maybe the history of rock and roll and where it went.
So, sure. So after I Put a Spell on You, and a number of years trying to sort of create a post-song career, post-one song, one-hit wonder, if you will, career, which really wasn't working out. The way it worked, like for an Alan Freed show and all the other performers, if you were the star, you were at the top of the bill and you closed the show. And then everybody in the bill on down was the top people were the most important or had the most recent hits. And Screamin Jay would start. He started up near the top, and then in a couple of years he was at the bottom of the bill. Bottom of the bill, you get poor placement in the shows. You got paid less. It wasn't much of a career. And in the early 60s, after the Beatles. So you talked about Rolling Stones copying the black music.
Yeah.
But what happened was in the late 50s, Bill Haley actually went to England, and he was equally as popular, perhaps more popular in England, because they were starving for rock and roll, teenagers there, as he was in the U.S., where he was beginning to fade already after 1956. And that spurred a whole interest in R&B in England, real R&B, not commercial, not doo-wop, but the real kind of R&B singers and musicians. And so that whole R&B craze took over a lot of the music, the real music aficionados in the UK. And it was a big deal to get, old 78s. Those were even the bigger platters from the 40s and the 30s of these recordings. So there was even more than the United States. There was really a deep interest in R&B, the real R&B.
Yeah, well, that was, I think it was related to the Northern Soul movement and
later
all of
on,
that.
the Northern Soul, which I think was a 60s thing.
Okay.
So but guys who were like the members of the Beatles or the members of the Rolling Stones, they were all part of that. Oh, look at this great R&B that's out. Look at these great tunes that you don't hear on the radio. So they knew those songs, and they would play them. And especially, the earliest Rolling Stone songs before Satisfaction were old R&B tunes. Like you said, they would, borrow those old R&B songs and make them sort of rock and rollish. And those were the first Rolling Stone songs. But anyway, there was a real affinity for this really core roots R&B in the UK. And in the early 60s, Screamin Jay Hawkins was invited to play in the UK. And, he was known by the core group of R&B fanatics, but not by the general public in the UK. So, but anyway, he played in a series of small clubs. The tour worked out okay. He had problems with the promoter, as always. Left in a huff, went back to the United States, but everybody thought about it and said, well, he really did a good job here. Let's invite him back again. So he came back and did another tour of, small venues throughout the UK. But, and some of the people, and we talked about Lord Such, they were so impressed to have Screamin Jay Hawkins that they pretty much sort of copied the act. And the same, Lord Such, never, he was kind of a politician too, so he never really dedicated his whole life to music. But then there was The Crazy World of Arthur Brown, who had that another one-hit wonder, but it was a number one hit in the U.S., I think, and it was called Fire. Good song, but whatever happened to Arthur Brown after that? So, but by the mid-'60s or late 60s, we started to see bands like really sort of dress up. They almost as if they had a show. So it would be guys like Alice Cooper, the band Kiss.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
So they really owed what they did, this performance art. Besides good music, they sort of had a look and a show, but they really owe it too.
They really did, yeah. I mean, I'm just looking at the Wikipedia forum, and they list, it says, he in turn influenced rock acts such as Alice Cooper, Tom Waits, The Cramps, Screaming Lord Such, Black Sabbath, Creedence Clearwater Revival, Arthur Brown, Led Zeppelin, Marilyn Manson, Rob Zombie, and Glenn Danzig. And I would say a whole lot more than that.
Yeah, so his influence kept going. So that was, so you take Kiss and you take Alice Cooper, that was one set of rock and roll where he influenced. But Creedence Clearwater Revival, who played a different kind of rock and roll, sort of country bayou rock and roll or swamp rock and roll, you might say.
Yeah, and they were Californians too, which makes it even funnier because they were doing Southern rock, but they were from California. In tangent.
Right. And, they did I Put a Spell on You. That was one of their earliest records that they released as a single. So doesn't make a difference. I mean, and Danzig, nothing like, there weren't even anything like Kiss. I mean, Danzig was punk. What was, I mean, it was a different world.
Yeah. All right. Hope you really enjoyed that. We unfortunately got cut short as Steve's internet went out. So there's no gentle end of that podcast, but I hope you really enjoyed it. And thank you again to Steve Bergsman. All right. Don't forget to check out The Magic of Tarot, our brand new course with legendary author Lon Milo Duquette, and all of our other almost 30 courses at magick.me. The world's best online school for magic, meditation, and mysticism. www.magick.me, magick.me. I will see you in class, and I will see you next time. Lots of love. Hang in there. See you soon.